Well, today is the official beginning of a new sermon series titled I Love Jesus But Not the Church. And the reason it's the official beginning is because last week on Easter Sunday, I kind of did a soft opening for the sermon series. And what I mean by that is that I laid some of the groundwork for today's message and for the messages that will come between now and Mother's Day. And so if you weren't here last week, that's all right. I'm going to fill you in on one of the key points that you need to know to really be able to get where we're going with this message series. And so that idea is this, that if you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the stories about Jesus, you'll discover that Jesus liked people who are nothing like him. And this is a little bit surprising because you would think Jesus would only associate with other people like Jesus. But again, if you read the text itself, you'll find that Jesus actually liked people who are nothing like him. And this is important because you might know somebody or you might be somebody who would say like, I'm not religious, or I'm not churchy, or, I'm not a Goody Two-Shoes, which, by the way, I had to look up that phrase. That goes all the way back to the 1700s, which is a pretty interesting story. But if you're one of these people that say you're not religious, not churchy, not a Goody Two-Shoes, or maybe your neighbor is this person or your coworker, what they're saying is they're not like Jesus. And the underlying assumption there is that because they're not like Jesus, Jesus probably wouldn't like them. And let's just be honest, most of us gravitate towards people that seem to like us, and we stay away from those that don't like us, at least we don't think they like us. And so it's important for you to know if you're in this category, or for you to be able to communicate to somebody, a neighbor or a friend or a coworker, if they're in this category, that actually the more not like Jesus they are, probably the more that Jesus would like them. Because again, Jesus liked people who were nothing like him. And if you need an example of that from the scripture, we filmed a message last week. It's up online. It's on our website. On YouTube. Now, another thing happens if you read the Gospels and start to pay attention to this dynamic. You find out that Jesus liked people who are nothing like him, but also people who are nothing like Jesus actually liked Jesus. And my own story actually bears this out. Because in college, I was not very religious, nor was I churchy, and I definitely wasn't a Goody Two-Shoes. I was a fraternity boy, and you can draw your own conclusions about that, okay? But let me just say this. If I was to show up the way I was back then, you would not call me to be your pastor, okay? So I was not much like Jesus, but I started to read about Jesus because I understood that if I was going to be smart and be able to hold a conversation, that I needed to know a little something about him. And I was interested in being smart because I had discovered that some of the girls I was interested in were interested in smart guys. And so I was trying to read about Jesus. Anyways, you see the picture. I didn't have good motives, all right? But I started reading about Jesus anyways. And what I found is I kind of started liking him. And I read the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew chapter, anybody remember? Come on now, chapter 5, hold up your hand like this, chapter 5. If you haven't read the Sermon on the Mount, you should read it sometime. It's great. I read some of these teachings. I was like, wow, this guy is actually really, really good. And I'd grown up in the church, but I'd never really gotten to know Jesus. So I started to like him. And then this other thing started to happen to me. I started to want to be like him. Which leads me to this conclusion that those who start to like Jesus eventually want to be like Jesus. And I wanted to be like Jesus. I wasn't religious. I wasn't churchy. I didn't know about being a Christian. I didn't know about going to church, but I did know I wanted to be like Jesus. And here's the strange thing. Now I'm a pastor and I lead a church, but I would tell you as a leader of this church that our goal is not to make you a church member. It's not about making you a church member. Now, it's great if you become a church member, and that's important, and there's things about that, but our goal is not to make you a church member. Our goal is to help you be like Jesus. That's what it's all about. And if you're going to become like Jesus, a couple things need to happen. One thing that needs to happen is that you need to have this private, personal connection with God like Jesus had. If you read the stories of Jesus, you find that he's often getting away from the crowds, and he's going and he's praying, and he's got this direct, intimate connection with the creator of the universe, his Father, our Father in heaven. And you need to have that too if you're going to be like Jesus. But there's this other thing that Jesus does as well that you really need to have in your life if you're going to become like Jesus. It is a gathering of people. It is a social dynamic. It is a community of other followers, other people heading in the same direction. It is basically a church. whatever expression of church, and there's many different expressions of church out there, but we all need to have some sort of community if we're going to be like Jesus. And if you read the stories of Jesus, what does he do right in the beginning? He begins to invite people to join him because he understands there's a private side and there's a personal side. And so we all need both. And the church is intended to help you grow in that relationship. The church is intended to encourage you and help you make progress and help lift you up. But here's the difficult thing. We're also well aware that the church can stand in the way rather than lead the way to Jesus. That some of you, that some people out in our community have come into contact with the church, and the effect on their lives has not been to lead them to Jesus, but instead it's stood in the way, that has hurt them rather than helped them. And we don't want to be that kind of church. We want to be the kind of church that leads people to a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the ways in which the church can stand in the way, because that is really the way to make sure that we don't become a church that stands in the way of a relationship with Jesus. Because here's one thing that's true about Faith United Church of Christ, and I believe it's true actually about every church. We always have the potential to be the kind of church that stands in the way rather than leads the way. So we need to be aware of that. The good news is we always also have the potential to be the kind of church that leads the way. So we're going to start talking about that today. And I thought since we're just getting into this series, we would start with something really, really easy. Politics. Hope you would find that funny. Politics, right? If you talk to people about why they would say, I love Jesus but not the church, or why people don't participate in the church, some of them, not all of them, but some of them would say that they don't attend church because it felt like the church had a political agenda. It's not my personal experience, but I know it to be true. I've talked to people who felt that way. And if you know anything about the religious right, I'm going to talk about them for just a second. You would know about these organizations. The Moral Majority, please go back. The Moral Majority and Focus on the Family, which were founded in the late 70s, Jerry Falwell and James Dobson. And then in, I think, the late 80s, Pat Robertson founded the Christian Coalition. Now, these three men, the founders of these organizations, they were people of faith. And their faith convictions, they would tell you, I believe, is what led to their political understandings. And that's okay. I think that that's how it should work, that our faith actually should have political implications. And these organizations, one of the things that they understood is that there was actually a political potential for Christians. And so they came up with a strategy to try to reach that group of people and mobilize them to get certain candidates elected. So Reagan was helped by the Moral Majority and Focus on the Family, and George W. Bush was helped by the Christian Coalition. And again, I think that that's our right, because our faith does have political implications. The problem is that some people, not all of them, but some of them, they began to get mixed up. The problem is that they put their politics in front of their discipleship. My discipleship, my faith should be in front of my politics, but there's always this potential to get them confused, where my politics are leading and not my faith. And it's okay when it's this way, but when it gets confused, it becomes a problem. And some of the people that have walked away from the church or been hurt by the church, it felt like in these cases that to be a Christian meant to be a Republican or hold certain viewpoints. Now, if you're a Republican before you leave, let me just say this. The liberals do it too. The Democrats do it too. That we're not immune from this sort of thing, and that's where I lean, but we're not immune from this. In fact, I heard a story this past week about a guy that he grew up in a small town, kind of conservative environment, grew up loving the church, but there was a problem. He's gay, and so he didn't feel accepted. And so when he moved to the big city, he found himself a liberal-leaning church, which was wonderful for him because he felt accepted for the first time. But then his perspective is that church seemed to be more about their political issues than the discipleship piece. And in fact, his mom and dad came to visit once, which was a big deal for him and for his family because they still were really troubled by his sexual identity. But they loved their son and they were trying to be like Jesus. And so they came to visit this church that was very different than them. And after the worship service, there was a conversation about issues involving gay rights. And so the church was talking about it, and the mom who felt welcomed when she got there, when they started to talk about their politics, she felt like she was being mocked, being disrespected, very much unloved. And somehow, their devotion to Christ got put in second fiddle to their devotion to their political views. So we liberals do it too. The conservatives do it, the liberals do it. So what's the solution? All the libertarians in the group would say, be a libertarian, but libertarians do it. And throw up the Green Party. We don't really talk about them much anymore, but the Green Party, like all of us have this potential to get this confused. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at perhaps the most politically charged moment in the life of Jesus, to get a little insight on how we can approach political conversations as the body of Christ. And we're going to start off in Luke 23, and then we're going to transition to John 18. It's two versions of the same story. And I'm going to be preaching from the Message translation. If you haven't heard of that, it's great. It's a modern translation. And so we'll jump right in. So Luke 23, 1 and 2. Then the they is the Jewish religious political leaders of the time. Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the politics and the religion, they were really kind of molded together for the Jewish people. So they all took Jesus to Pilate. Pilate is a Roman official who had been put in charge of Judea, the area where Jerusalem is. And the reason he's in charge is because the appointed Jewish leader, the Romans prefer to have a local ruling over, that appointed Jewish leader, he just couldn't hack it. So they bring in their own official, in this case is Pilate. And you probably know who Pilate is. You hear about him on Easter. So they, the political, religious leaders, all took Jesus to Pilate and began to bring charges against him. Well, what are the charges? Let's look at them. They said, we found this man undermining our law and order. Not the Roman law, but their law. And they would say God's law. But the truth is it's their particular interpretation of that law. And when Jesus came along, he had a different interpretation and a different application. And so in many regards, this charge is true. Jesus was undermining and challenging their interpretation of things. But this was not enough to get Jesus killed. And so they upped the ante. He was also forbidding taxes to be paid to Caesar, which is a lie. Because Jesus, at one point in time, he was asked about this question, and he told somebody to pull a coin out of their pocket, and he said, whose face is on that? And it was Caesar's. And if you grew up with the King James Version, just say it with me, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Yeah, pay him. Go ahead and pay Caesar what is his. Jesus did not forbid taxes. Total lie. But then they said he set himself up as a Messiah king. Now, this is the big one, because there's one Savior. There's one king, and it's Caesar. And this is the kind of thing that gets you killed. This is the kind of thing that gets you put on a cross. And they did it all the time. And so Pilate, he sends the Jewish political religious leaders away, and he summons Jesus. Now, this is the next morning. Jesus was arrested the night before. And they already beat him up, so he's probably got a black eye, and he's already been roughed up quite a bit, up all night long. But Jesus, he comes up, and Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? Like, hey, okay, just tell me, are you? And Jesus, his response is so confident and so composed. And I actually think there's compassion in it and curiosity. Look what he says. Are you saying this on your own? Or did others tell you this about me? Because in political conversations, often we just take something that somebody else said, and then we take it as if it is truth. In Jesus, he has enough curiosity and enough compassion to say to Pilate, was this something just told to you? Or did you come up with this on your own? Pilate replies, do I look like a Jew? I think that Pilate's kind of a jerk, okay? Do I look like a Jew? Your people and your high priest turned you over. What did you do? Pilate's like, let's cut to the chase. I'm a busy man. Let's get to it. But Jesus, he's smart. He knows that we often get in these kind of tit for tat sort of arguments, these low level arguments, he said, she said, and it just goes nowhere. And so Jesus, he elevates the conversation. My kingdom, Jesus said, doesn't consist of what you see around you. You see, other kings, they're all about buildings and territory and who's in charge. But my kingdom, it's something else. It's something different. If it did, my followers would fight. So I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. Now, this is pretty true, but there's one caveat. Because there is this moment where one of his followers attempts to fight. Raleigh, would you come here, please? Raleigh, seriously, everybody, a round of applause. All right. This is an ear, okay? Hold that up to your ear, okay? So Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we're told that Peter, one of his disciples, pulls out a sword and cuts off the ear. Cuts off the ear. There you go. Drop it on the floor. Cuts off an ear, right? And Jesus stops Peter and he says, hold on a second. This is not what my kingdom is about. I'm paraphrasing now. But those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Peter puts the sword away. And then look at what Jesus does. The gospel writer says he bends down, takes the guy's ear that's just been cut off, and he puts it back on. You can have your ear back. All right, Raleigh, seriously, everybody. This is somebody coming to arrest Jesus. Somebody that's coming to hurt Jesus. And Jesus helps him. Not only do his followers not fight, they help people, even the people attacking them. This is how different it is. Look, just going on that. But I'm not that kind of king, the kind of king that hurts people and destroys people. Not the world's kind of king. I'm a different kind of king. This leads to a question that's kind of at the heart of the matter. Are you more about Jesus' kingdom or the world's kingdom? The last time you got into a heated political conversation with a relative or a neighbor, were you more about Jesus' kingdom or the world's kingdom? And I'm not saying we shouldn't have strong political views. I think we should. But whose kingdom are you more about? Because one behaves one way, and the other behaves a different way. The Pilate said, so are you a king or not? He's like confused, okay? Right? Because Jesus is trying to elevate the conversation, say it's bigger than this little fight we all get into about territory and who's right and who's in power. There's something bigger going on. But Pilate's having a hard time understanding that. Jesus answers, you tell me. Which again, I kind of feel like this is a compassionate statement. It's like, I believe that you can understand this. I'm going to give you an opportunity to think it through. Come on, Pilate, think a little bit bigger, think a little bit larger. But it seems that Pilate doesn't respond, so Jesus just goes on. He says, because I'm a king, I was born, I entered the world so that I could witness to the truth. And right there's the distinction. Followers of Jesus witness to the truth rather than fight for it. Witness for the truth rather than fight for it. There's a difference. When I was in college, kind of same period when I started reading the Gospels, I was studying politics a lot. I was writing papers on it. It was during the Iraq War and the war on terrorism and Guantanamo Bay and all those sorts of things. And I was angry about that. And I read a lot about it. I wrote papers on it. And if you wanted to have a nice dinner conversation, you better not invite me. Okay? Because I was mad. And my poor father, who, because he loved me, would often talk with me about this stuff, and who had voted Republican his entire life and voted Bush into office, I just attacked him and attacked him and attacked him. And it was unfair because, again, he spent his day doing his job, and I spent my day just reading about this stuff. And one day, I'll never forget it. After so many different conversations where it ended with him being angry and everybody being uncomfortable, Dad said to me, he said, you know what, son, you might be right. But the way you're talking to me, I don't even want to listen to you. And that's the way a lot of us do our politics. It is good that you have a viewpoint and you should witness for the truth that God has given you. And there are times that we should take measures and we should march and do those sorts of things. Those are necessary. But in your average political conversation, are you fighting and trying to destroy and win the argument, or can you just witness to the truth. My next door neighbor has different politics than me. And if I approached him like I used to approach people, it would ruin the relationship. And that would be sad because our kids play together. We really like these people. Maybe for the first time ever in this last election cycle, I just said, hey, help me understand your views. I don't get it. Help me understand. And then when he welcomed it, when he invited it, I witnessed to the truth that I have. Everyone, Jesus is still talking, everyone who cares for the truth, who has a feeling for the truth, recognizes my voice. Everyone who cares for the truth more than their political position, more than their views as they currently hold them. We all have our own political views, but do we care more about the truth? Are we willing to be changed? I think is the question. And if that is your priority, you don't have them mixed. You'll recognize Jesus' voice when he speaks to you through the Holy Spirit. Pilate said, "What is truth?" And this part of the story, this is so good and it's so powerful to me because it tells me that this sort of stuff happens. Because Jesus, he's the master communicator, and he tries to elevate the conversation. He tries to get Pilate to see it on a different level, and it doesn't work. Pilate's still stuck in this kind of low-level thing. What is the truth? Come on, Jesus. And that tells you and I that even if you follow Jesus' footsteps, sometimes it doesn't work out. The person doesn't see the other perspective. But then again, it should have never been to win the argument, so to speak. And Pilate, he's definitely not won over. But he went back out to the Jews and told them, I find nothing wrong in this man. And maybe at the very least, when you have a political conversation, can the other person walk away saying, I find nothing wrong in this man or in this woman? That we might not have agreed on the policy or the candidate or the whatever, but they respected me and they talked to me in such a way, they listened in such a way that I find nothing wrong with them. Maybe that's the best sometimes we can shoot for. We got midterm elections coming up. That makes some of you groan. And one strategy for us as a church is just not talk about it so we can all get along and enjoy worshiping together. But I don't think that's the best place to be as a church. What if we could talk about it in such a way that we added to our knowledge and we added to our connection rather than created tension? What if we could learn to be like Jesus and have these conversations in a respectful, helpful manner? Because that's what Jesus' followers should be. Jesus' followers should be the most confident, curious, composed, and compassionate people in the room. If we're really following Jesus, we should show up and we should be confident, meaning we're like not on the ropes. I don't need to come out swinging because I'm confident in my viewpoints. I'm confident that ultimately, like, my salvation is done. I know where I'm going. Like, God is in control. I don't need to be on the ropes. Therefore, I can be curious. Because you know what? God's wisdom is infinite. And so there's things you don't know. There really are. And no matter how many years on this planet you've had, God has more to teach you. And Jesus remains, I think, curious in this conversation. And it's a heated political conversation, and so should we. And he's composed the whole time. He's not raising his voice. He's not attacking Pilate's character. Did you notice that? That's amazing, because that's normally where we go to. No character attacks. None of that. And he's compassionate. And what if every room that you were in, you're the most confident, curious, composed, and compassionate person? Because that other person you're talking to, you don't know their full story. You don't know what they've been through, what they've read, what they've experienced. So can you be compassionate about their story and curious? This would make a difference. We would become the kind of church where when politics came up, it would draw people to the church rather than repel them. If we would learn to be like this. So here's the application, and then I'll pray for you and we're done. It's real simple. It's view your politics through the lens of Jesus. rather than Jesus through the lens of your politics. And we do the opposite, don't we? So what would it look like to get that arrangement correct? And if you don't know what the lens of Jesus is, then maybe you need a church or a community, others to talk to. Maybe you need some more private time, some more devotional time. But can you develop that lens of Jesus Christ and let that be the thing you look at the political issues through, rather than starting with, I'm this or I'm that, and then I'm going to use Jesus to support my position. Get this right. People will not only love Jesus, but they love the church. Let us pray. God, I thank you that you gave us such an easy topic to start with. I thank you even more that you gave us the example of Jesus, who can lead us to better relationships, that can lead us to be more free, that can lead us to be capable to communicate to others in a way that they would listen and walk away, maybe not always convinced by what we have to say, but walk away with respect for us. God, I pray for this church that in this upcoming election season, that we would be a church that doesn't shy away from talking about politics, but Lord, that we do it with you always first. And that we would see the bigger picture. That while politics matter, it matters who our officials are and what the policies are, that the even greater thing is your kingdom. We thank you for your son, Jesus. In his name we pray.